Welcome and good morning to our discussion on funding from a place of trust, focusing on the importance of flexible funding in the Asia-Pacific region. My name is Marina Pujay, and I am with the advisory team here at the Synergos Institute. We are proud to present the fourth event in our regional series based on our published report, Funding from a Place of Trust, commissioned by Citi Foundation. Now, just to go through a quick agenda for our agenda for today, we will be having some welcome and introductions from my lovely colleague and our moderator for today, Natasha Tariq. We will then hear from Dorothy Stamke from Citi Foundation. And then we will have some key takeaways from one of our report writers, Fern Millay. We will then dive into a panel featuring 4 wonderful panelists representing different voices from across the region. And we will be ending with an open Q&A. So let's get started. I warmly welcome our moderator for today, Natasha, to our virtual stage.
Hi, good morning and welcome to this virtual conversation on funding from a place of trust. My name is Natasha Tariq and I'm based in Hong Kong. I am the Director of Philanthropy and the lead in Asia at Synergos, where I manage a community of leading philanthropic families and social investors using their time and influence to fight poverty and social injustice in their own countries and globally. At Synergos, we try and solve complex issues around the world, and by advancing bridging leadership, which we believe builds both trust and collective action. It really is a pleasure to be here today to facilitate the conversation and guide you through the session. Our discussion today builds on a namesake report called Funding from a Place of Trust, exploring the value of general operating support and capacity building grants. The report was commissioned by Citi Foundation, authored by us here at Synergos, and it was launched this week in Asia. So if you haven't seen it already, we will be sharing it in a follow-up email after the session. In this session, as we said, we will be hearing opening remarks from the Citi Foundation, followed by brief highlights from one of the co-authors of the report, and finally a panel discussion with a mix of funders and nonprofits. The session really aims to explore non-programmatic funding in the form of general operating support, capacity building grants, and overall flexible funding. And we will discuss its role in some of the critical things that the social impact sector is calling upon to deliver, such as innovation, collaboration, learning and measurement, and adjusting to the changing needs of our communities, and specifically at this time, responding to a crisis. With that in mind, it's both a timely and lasting report, especially here in Asia. And what I really hope is for our conversation to dig beneath the surface of the COVID timeline and tug at undercurrents such as measuring impact, supporting grassroots organizations, the power dynamics of grant making and grant receiving, and the structure of philanthropic organizations. I really look forward to learning from everyone here, and our principle is very much that wisdom is in the room. So please do include yourselves in our conversation through the chat function as both participants and with the panelists to share your wisdom and experiences from the context of funding from a place of trust. As we start, Synergos, as I mentioned, was commissioned by the Citi Foundation to write this report. So I will now give you to Dorothy Stamke from the Citi Foundation to open up this discussion. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you, Natasha. Good morning and good evening. I wanted to just take a moment to welcome everyone and thank all of you for joining today's webinar. Like many funders, the Citi Foundation has been evolving its approach to flexible funding over the years. 10 years ago, the Citi Foundation created new ways to fund capacity building internationally. And 4 years ago, the foundation launched a US program that has provided more than 40 million in unrestricted grants. So the topic of flexible funding is a topic of great interest, not only to us, but we know the same to be true for the sector as well. And that's why we commissioned today's report, Funding from a Place of Trust. It goes without saying that given the global pandemic we are facing, we all find ourselves in one of the most pivotal learning moments we may ever experience. We are in the position to see even more clearly now how flexible funding can be fundamental. And like many of you, the Citi Foundation has adapted its policies and funding strategies because of the crisis, providing more flexibility across the work we fund. And as we continue to listen and learn, I think we all have an opportunity and perhaps a responsibility to create a new normal. I hope this report contributes to the discussions in the sector that the sector is having, and that it will help all of us further our thinking in Asia and beyond. Because what we're grappling with is how we ensure that the flexibility that was made possible because of COVID-19 are changes that are institutionalized. How do we ensure that the new normal, one where trust, partnership, and flexibility, themes that are at the heart of this report, remain truly center stage, not only during a crisis, but in the long run as well? I want to thank Synergos for their partnership, the esteemed panelists for your time and insights today, as well as those joining us on the call on this webinar. So let me turn the floor back to Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you for the support that Citi has given us through this journey. I will now ask my colleague Fern, one of the co-authors of this report, to lay some context, and then we'll go into a discussion with our panelists around what they see in their different spaces in the sector. Thank you, Fern.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Dorothy. Wonderful to join you today. Let me tell you a little bit about the report. This report is a result of research that looks at general operating support and capacity building grants for nonprofits. And we asked the question, how do these kinds of funding add value, and how do they enable changes within nonprofits that drive results at the community level? By general operating support, we mean unrestricted funding that is fully flexible, that doesn't have limitations on time or use. And by capacity building grants, we mean funds that are used to strengthen the overall organizational health of grantees. So these are investments in skills, capabilities, and systems, et cetera. And the purpose of this work is really to contribute to the discussion, to think about general operating support and capacity building grants more deeply, especially at this time when there's more and more consensus on the importance of this flexible funding, but still not enough donors are prepared to extend it. And as we heard from Dorothy, the global pandemic that we're experiencing throws a new and urgent spotlight on this topic, and on the importance, or indeed the necessity, of flexible funding, not just as an emergency response, but as a core way of funding. In Asia and globally, we need strong community-based organizations that are not just implementers of programs, but are an integral part of the infrastructure and are able to pivot when necessary, as in a crisis or when an opportunity emerges, to keep serving the community. And general operating support and capacity building grants play a role, as we will hear. The key insights in the report are drawn from conversations with more than 60 among donors, intermediaries, and community-based organizations. And the core of the report are 4 profiles of organizations, including the perspective of some of their grantees. The profiles explore the role that general operating support and capacity building grants play in the dynamic of donor-grantee relationships and the value that they bring, as well as the changes, both tangible and intangible, that happen within the nonprofit and that drive results. And you see them, you'll see on the screen the names of the organizations featured in the report, which include the Firelight Foundation, which works in Africa with community-based organizations. 2 of their grantee partners are also featured. We have the Whatcom Community Foundations from the United States, and 2 of their partners featured who work on food security and economic opportunity. We have Career Ready, which is a nonprofit based in the UK working on education. And we have an intermediary organization, the Global Fund for Children, an international NGO that works with 120 grantee partners around the world, including many in Asia. 2 of these partners are featured in the report, and we're delighted to have Arpan from India among our panelists today. So the organizations featured in the report have different institutional structures that are illustrative of the range of players that we find in the field of development and philanthropy today. And likewise, today on our panel, we have a cross-section of organizations working on the donor side, working on community development at the grassroots level, serving as intermediaries in the field, and all of them focused ultimately on bringing positive social and economic change to communities. And notwithstanding the different ways of operating and geographic scope and the sectors of activity, there are key themes in the report that resonate widely across these organizations. And let me touch briefly on the key insights from the report. In the first instance, a key insight that is woven through research and the conversations and is reflected in the title of the report and this event is the notion that flexible funding can really be seen as a form of trust capital. So funding from a place of trust indicates that the initial emphasis comes from the giver, from the organization that writes the checks. The donors, by choosing to provide flexible funding, give up some control and signal the intention to work in a more equal partnership. Secondly, trust is not born in a vacuum. It is earned over time. So it's important to have a long-term commitment to flexible funding. By investing early and for the long haul, this is a good way to build a relationship that gives a grantee a sense of stability and the ability to focus on what the community needs, and to have those needs drive the interventions. When nonprofit organizations have the confidence to make decisions about the use of funds, we find that this really creates a level playing field. It helps overcome a deficit mindset and serves as a license to innovate for the nonprofit. The role of the donor then can become that of a thinking partner. And in the process, learning and capacity building can flow both ways. Flexible funding can also help create a more level playing field among smaller and larger NGOs, where the smaller local organizations may not have the access, the resources, or the voice of the larger ones. Next is the idea that long-term flexible funding combined with capacity building grants can be somewhat of a gold standard, can be very powerful. This is a combination of funds and inputs that can allow an organization to build skills and not have to trade off between building capacity and building their programs. And the presence of flexible funding, even in small measure compared to programmatic funding, can ensure that new capacity is acquired and sustained over time. And we'll hear from some of the organizations on how they have benefited from a combination of these. So funding doesn't have to be large to have a beneficial impact if it's flexible. The notion of grantee readiness is also important. General operating support and capacity building funding can contribute to this readiness in terms of the ability to use the funds to better fulfill mission and impact. This is not just in terms of skills and competencies, but it's also associated with a mindset of pursuing impact goals and not just project goals. So organizations that rely heavily on restricted programmatic funding, they can find themselves trapped by having to think in terms of project goals rather than having that latitude of defining what success and impact mean for them and their community on a broader level. 3 of the organizations profiled in the report are intermediaries of funding, and that is, they're both grantees and donors, and as such, they have a perspective on general operating support and capacity building grants from this dual angle. When restricted funds flow through intermediaries, the restrictions are passed on to grantee partners. So these intermediaries can be strong advocates for flexible funding because they know the advantages firsthand, and they can amplify the voice of community-based organizations. We also find that when flexible funding flows through intermediaries, you create a chain of trust that reaches from the original funder all the way to the community level. It's difficult to trace the impact of capacity building grants and general operating support on results because the flexibility of general operating support does not lend itself to baselines and timelines for measuring. And there is little hard evidence still of how capacity building grants can drive impact. So it can be challenging to trace a linear causality between these. Some interesting methodologies are emerging, and one of them is featured in a report called Outcome Harvesting. And it's a collaborative process between donor and grantee that looks at outcomes first and then traces back the causality to the inputs and the forces that led to those changes. Finally, while it's difficult to trace how capacity building grants and general operating support impact results, these forms of flexible funding can certainly play a role in strengthening monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, MEL for short. Which MEL usually requires a large investment because social outcomes are more difficult to measure than business outcomes. Yet the burden is too often on nonprofits to provide evidence of results when they may be lacking the resources and the capacity to run an effective MEL system. MEL system investments are less useful when linked to a specific grant or project, and they're more useful when they're set up to provide data and learnings that inform the strategy. Donors can support grantees in designing an MEL system that serves the purposes of the grantee itself and of the community they serve. In sum, for organizations that are on the ground making a difference, the value of flexible funding and capacity building grants is unquestionable. Funding from a place of trust is a practice that shifts decision-making closer to the community. It helps ensure that interventions are community-driven rather than donor-driven. And it helps to build stability, to foster learning, and create the conditions for a nonprofit to innovate, to pivot in a crisis, as we're all experiencing now, to respond to opportunities as well. Not just as implementers of programs or organizations called on to fill gaps, but as equal partners and as an integral part of the infrastructure. Thank you, and now back to Natasha to hear directly from our panelists.
Hi, thank you, Fern. Those were such great insights. And before we go on to the panelists, I'd like to remind you to please feel free to write your thoughts and questions into the chat so that we can all imagine that we're in a room together as a community in this virtual space. It would also be wonderful as we go through the session for you to reflect on the word trust and what it means for you individually and as an organization in the sector. Here at Synergos, we really emphasize building trust, and we see that as a way of creating space, opportunities in the foundation of flexible funding, and the true relationship between grantees and donors. So would love for you to think about what trust means for you through the session. Okay, let's move now to the panel discussion. Panelists, I've had the pleasure of speaking to you each individually, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this forum. Our audience today is a mix of institutional funders, individual philanthropists, international and grassroots civil society organizations, and concerned members of society. Our hope is that your insights can spark way for our audience to take action in their organizations. Audience, please do feel free to send us your questions, either for all panelists or for a specific organization. I'm looking out for them. If we cannot get to all of them, I promise you we'll find a way to address them. So please send them over. It gives me great pleasure now to move to our first panelist, who I will be speaking to, Mr. Ai Luming, the chairman of the Society of Entrepreneurs and Ecology in China. Mr. Ai, welcome. Can you hear me?
首先，特别欢迎艾路明先生，他是中国阿拉善 S11 生态协会的会长，欢迎他首先来参加我们这一次的 Q&A 的环节。
好，大家好 ，Hi everybody.
Hello, Mr. Ai. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really delighted to have you. I would love for you to introduce yourself and speak to us a little about flexible funding trends and thoughts around this in China, especially given your position as a leader with such a large number of grants to NGOs throughout China. We would love to hear details such as the mix of that funding, flexible, restricted, unrestricted. Thank you.
谢谢您，艾先生。那么首先呢，我再次对您表示欢迎。那么接下来，请您能否简单介绍一下自己？同时呢，您作为中国公益事业的重要领军人，为中国的民间组织提供了大量的资助。您能否就弹性资金资助在中国的发展趋势和相关理念的一个情况进行简单的一个介绍？这种弹性资助呢，主要是用于机构内部的行政运营、能力建设的目的，并且呢，使用周期限制比较宽松。另外呢，您是否能够具体谈一谈，在这种弹性资金、限制性或者是非限制性的资助的时候呢，该怎么样进行有效的组合？
好的，谢谢。我首先来介绍一下我们的机构，我们是阿拉善 SEE 生态协会，这是一家由将近1000位中国的各方面的企业家组成的一个环保的公益基金会。我们的基金会呢，通过关注环保的项目、环保的领域，来推动中国的环境保护事业的开展，并且呢，我们也是中国在环境领域里面支柱性的一个公益机构。也就是说呢，在中国有超过600家的不同的 NGO 组织或者是个人，就是关注环保的 NGO 组织和个人得到过我们的资助。在中国的环境保护领域里面，我们大约应该是超过90%的环保 NGO 组织得到我们的资助。所以阿拉善 SE 生态协会在中国是一个非常重要的环境保护的这样一个公益机构，这样一个基金会。
First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to brief you on what SEE is. SEE, or the Society of Entrepreneurship and Ecological Conservation, consists of now about 1,000 enterprise members, and it's an organization dedicated to the projects on ecological conservation and related undertakings in the society. We pay a lot of attention to ecological improvement, and also we provide funding to those non-public organizations as welfare efforts, public welfare efforts. And actually, according to estimation, we have provided funds to over 600 non-government organizations or individuals who are very concerned in this regard. And also, it's safe to say that we have funded about 90% of these individuals or agencies. So I can say that SEE is a very important leader in environment protection and ecological conservation in China.
实际上呢，根据我们的经验，在中国资助不同的环境保护的 NGO 组织，这种用于能力建设和一般性这种弹性支出的资金，要分不同的阶段来进行安排。
So speaking from my own experience, I think, for us to fund those NGOs, especially in terms of CB and GOB funding, we have to, phase in this regard.
Yeah, 如果是对于这种初创的这种 NGO 组织和个人，他们刚开始在成立自己的机构，他们希望关注环境保护的某一个领域，来推动这样一个领域的改善。那么呢，对于这样一些初创的机构，我们认为呢，这种资助的资金可能大部分用于弹性支出和能力建设，是会对这个机构更有帮助。因为通常成立的这样机构呢，他们并没有在这样一个 NGO 组织的运营的经验，而这方面的资助呢，常常呢，如果是陷入某一个具体的项目里面，成为项目资金的话，那么常常会约束他们自己的能力的发展，从而呢，不利于这个组织的成长。 所以呢，我们认为，在一般而言，在一个3年之内的这种 NGO 组织，他们通常呢需要一个更加多的弹性的资金或者能力建设的资金用于他们的发展，并且呢，这样一种方式呢，可能更容易建立一个资助者和被资助者之间的信任关系。好。
So I would like to take up your question in terms of the startup funding. Actually, if it is to help a startup NGO, I think it's not proper for these NGOs to be too much engaged in a specific ecological project. That is why we need to provide them with some flexible funds for their capacity building at the very first, because in the initial stage of development, they don't have much experience in what they do, and if we invest in too much investment, invest in a particular project, this actually may restrain the growth of their capacity. So this is not the right way to do things. So therefore, in my opinion, in the first 3 years of this startup, it's important to provide them with flexible funding for their capacity building, for their future sustainable growth. And also in this way, we can build a trustworthy relationship between founders and grantees.
在我们阿拉善 SE 生态协会呢，我们在全国有将近30个不同的这个分支机构在开展活动，因为企业家们都在自己所在的城市关注自己所在地区的不同的环保项目。那么呢，我们会通过这样一些机构呢，来关注每一个地区的初创型的环保 NGO 组织。这些组织呢，我们给他们申请我们基金会的资助资金的这样一个名额，大概每年呢从10万到20万不等。我们会在一个我们把这个项目呢称之为创绿家，就是初创的绿色环保的这样一个创绿家的一个机构，这样一个名目吧，这样一个品牌的项目。那么凡是申请我们创绿家的这样一个这些 NGO 组织和个人呢，他们都可以获得一个每年10万到20万不等的这样一个资助的资金。那么这个资金是完全可以用于弹性的支出和能力建设的支出的。那么呢，这种支出呢，通常会有3年的时间。也就是说呢，一个机构成为我们申请我们的这样一个项目，我们会给他3年的连续的资助，每年呢10万到20万不等的资金，根据他们的项目而来。这笔资金呢，他们100%的都可以用于弹性的支出和能力的建设。
You see, at SE, we are a rather large organization with about 30 branches across the whole China, because our enterprise members, they come from different regions and provinces in China, and also they are concerned about different ecological projects. So this is why we mainly run through these branches, and each branch will attach great significance to the startup NGOs. And also, annually speaking, they will have the quota to give out to these NGOs about 100 to 200 grants per year under the program for entrepreneurs called 创绿家. In this way, these startup NGOs could have, a specific funding aside 100% for the use of flexible funding and also the capacity building. And actually this would last for 3 years of their initial stage. That is to say, for the 3 years straight, they would get 100 to 200 grants per year, absolutely for their flexible use.
那么通过了这本3年的这种资助以后呢，那么在这样一些初创的 NGO 组织中间，或者不是这些机构，是另外的已经有一些年的运作经验的环保 NGO 组织呢，他们可以向我们阿拉善 SE 生态协会呢再申请一个更进一步的项目。这个项目我们称之为近草同行，就是那种像草一样的 在遍地生长的 NGO 组织呢，他们会成为一个茁壮成长的草，啊，我们查的劲草同行。同行的意思呢，就是我们会有我们的企业家，我们会有这个企业家陪伴这些 NGO 组织共同的成长。这个时候呢，我们的资金呢会做一个不同的安排。那么对于凡是能够申请成功劲草同行项目的 NGO 组织呢，那么我们第一有每一个这种机构会有2位企业家陪伴这个机构成长，看看他们到底有哪些长处、哪些短处、哪些问题，我们来帮他解决。第二呢，给他们的资助的资金呢，大约有1半的资金是相对弹性的，然后更多的另外1半甚至于更多的资金呢，就会关注他们项目的运用，他们在项目上如何开展，项目上有哪些需要这个具体落实的这样一个资金的状况。通过这个项目资金的资助，他们在这个项目上取得了什么样的成绩，或者有什么样的不足，这样呢，再有3年的陪伴，帮助这个机构呢能够有更快的、更好的一种成长。当然，这个资金呢可能就会更多，大概每年从20万到50万，甚至于到100万不等。
Okay, and then after 3 years of initial development and experiences accumulation, these startup NGOs or some already quite experienced NGOs could then reapply for funding for their specific projects. Actually, this is conducted under another program under SEE that is called 劲草同行. By 劲草, we aim to show our encouragement to these NGOs for them to grow like grasses exuberating from the ground. And also by 同行 in Chinese, we try to send them a message that our enterprise members would accompany these NGOs in their growth and development. If they are successful in this application, then we would assign 2 enterprise members in company with these NGOs for them to grow, and these enterprise representatives would help those NGOs to find their strength, their weakness, or their problems so as to help them find the solutions. And at this stage, for their funding, actually at least a half of the funding can be considered flexible funds, and the rest of the fund could then be mainly invested in specific projects. And in this process, we will also have the evaluating mechanism to help us identify the problems and also to trace their achievements in different stages. And also I would like to highlight that on an annual basis, this startup or experienced NGOs would get about 200 to 500,000 per year, or even 1 million per year for their growth.
那么我们这样的一个劲草同行项目呢，实际上资金的问题已经不是最重要的一个资助范围了，而更重要的是我们需要有2个或者更多的关注这个项目的企业家来陪伴一个机构的成长。我想在这里面呢，给大家举一个案例来说明一下。在中国呢，现在有一个比较成功的关于猫科动物的保护组织，叫猫盟。那么最早呢，这个机构是关注华北豹的，华北豹一种珍稀动物吧，叫在学名应该叫北京豹，它是1890几年在北京地区发现的。那么这个华北豹呢，经过几十年的这样一个成长，或者越来越少了，现在成为一个比较危险的濒危的动物了。那么为了保护这样一个动物呢，有一帮年轻人呢，和有一些专家，有一些社会上的一些这样一些关注环保的人士呢，他们组建了一个机构叫猫盟，他们来保护这个华北豹。那么最早呢，他们刚刚成立的时候，我们资助过他们。那么随着后来他们成为我们这个劲草同行的伙伴，这样呢，我们有5、6个企业家陪伴这个组织一起来成长，并且呢，每年给他这个70万到100多万的资助，连续给他们3年。那么这个机构呢，通过 这些年的成长呢，那么现在呢，它已经在中国成为一个不仅仅是保护华北豹的一个猫科动物的环境保护组织，而且呢，成为在中国整个地区对猫科动物进行保护的一个组织。他们在西藏、新疆、这个四川、云南、这个山西等地呢，都在开展活动了。现在呢，他们通过他们自己的能力，每年筹措资金的项目资金能力已经可以达到200万以上。这样呢，我们认为这样一个资助就会帮助一个机构呢比较好的成长起来。
And also, I would like to emphasize that by providing funding to these NGOs is actually not the most paramount thing, because, you know, as I mentioned, for each NGO, we would assign at least 2 or even more enterprise representatives to help them grow. I would like to use one example to illustrate my point. So you see, in China, we have this League of Cat Animals, which is basically a foundation established for the protection of cat animals in China. And at first, they mainly focus on the protection of cat animals like leopards living in northeastern China. And then they also focus on the leopards found in Beijing, because, you know, all these leopards or other cat animals are now living in jeopardy. It's important to reach out to them. So actually, we have helped in this regard. At first, these NGOs was founded and also established under the auspice of some experts and social activists. But then, under our 近草同行 project, as I mentioned, this league has got our funding of worth 700,000 to 1 million per year for 3 years straight. And besides, we have 5 to 6 enterprise representatives to help them grow in this process. And after years of development, it's fair to say that currently this League of Cat Animals is not only preserving the northeastern cat animals in China, but also reaching out to other cat animals across the whole country. They have branches in Xizang, Xinjiang, Shanxi, Yunnan, and also Sichuan provinces. And all these efforts are really evidence of the importance of providing funding to these NGOs.
好，那么我想尽快来简短一点啊。这个，那么我们除了这个对于这样的资助的就是灵活资金和就能力建设的资金的这样一种关注之外呢，我们还认为这个尽管在我看到我们的报告里面写的是较多的这种灵活使用的资金和能力建设的资金对一个 NGO 组织的成长是有非常重要意义的，我们也同意这样一个观点。但是呢，可能我们还需要注意，在不同的这样一个文化和法律环境中间，这样的资助呢，可能是资助者还是需要关注的。我想呢，对于有一个较强的宗教信仰的这样一个文化里面，可能这样一种信任关系呢更容易建立。对于一个较强的法律环境、较好的法律环境、法治环境这样一个背景的国家呢，可能这样一种资助呢也是更有意义的。而像在有些地方、有些地区、有些文化中，这样的资助可能需要我们有更多的其他方面的关注，这样一种才能够更好的、更有利于建立这样一个信任关系，建立一个互相参与的关系，也才能够更好的使得我们的资金呢能够使用的好。那么我还想顺便还回答一个问题，刚才我看到有人提出一个问题，就是我们的这样的灵活制度的资金是哪里来的？我想简单的把我们阿拉善的资金的来源给大家报告一下。那么我们的资金大概分3个部分。第一部分呢是作为加入阿拉善的企业家，每人每年要捐赠 10万块钱，这样我们将近有1000位企业家嘛，差不多有将近1个亿的这样一个资金，这笔资金呢是完全可以灵活使用的。另外呢，我们每年会在我们阿拉善的内部有一个环境公益的拍卖的活动。那么不同的拍卖活动呢，这些资金呢大约可以筹集到这个5000万到8000万的资金。这些资金呢也是可以相对灵活的来使用的。第3笔资金呢是通过我们自己的品牌在通过公募的平台，比方说阿里巴巴、腾讯的99公益日这样的行动呢，在通过互联网的公募的这样一个方式获得的资金，而这些资金呢，就只能用于我们当初申报的项目，就是比方说用于梭的种植，就沙漠化防治，用于江豚的保护等等，这些呢资金呢只能固定在项目上面。所以大概我们有超过1半的资金，每年大概有3个亿左右的我们获得的捐赠。那么这3个亿里面，大概有1半呢是可以作为灵活了使用的这个 flexible 的这个资金和能力建设的资金。谢谢。
Okay, I would also like to briefly draw your attention to the flexible and also funding for capacity building, because as you mentioned, and also as I have already read some of your report, I really recognize the need for us to provide more flexible funding for GOS and also for CB development. However, at the same time, I would like to highlight the fact that, you know, in different countries, they usually have various cultures and various legal systems. And this is all the characteristics must be considered by the funder or the grant makers. Because you see, in a culture that is highly religious, it would be easier for the funders and the grantees to establish trust, and also for a society with a stronger and also a more stringent rule of law, maybe the funding would be easier to run. But it's also important for us to know that in some regions or cultures in the world, this still remain a problematic subject matter, because, you know, building trust does not come easy, but it is only through trustworthy relationship can we really go hand in hand and really make the best use of all the funds available to us. And also I noticed that there's a new pop-up question related to how SEE has managed to obtain such a big fund. I would like to respond to this question. You see, at SEE, we have mainly 3 sources of fundraising. First of all, we are a federation comprising different company and company members. Currently, we have around 1,000 enterprise members, and every year, each company would pay an annual fee of 100 grand, which means for every year, we would have a flexible funding of 100 million RMB. And the second source of our funding come from our auctions based on our environment public welfare projects, which usually brings us about 50 to 80 million RMB per year, which would also be used as a kind of flexible funding. And our third source comes from our cooperation with different public welfare projects under the auspice of Alibaba, Tencent 99, or other forms of internet-based public fundraising. We managed to use our brand to help us raise funds for specific projects, such as, you know, the planting of saxaul trees in Western China to help us address the desertification issue, and also for our protection of porpoises living in the Yangtze River. And generally speaking, on an annual basis, we get about 300 million RMB, and about 1/2 of these funds could be used in a more flexible manner, for example, for our capacity building.
好，我刚才还看到 有一个问题，就是我们是否资助那些中国以外的这个NGO 组织？是这样的，我们现在呢，刚开始关注海外的一些 NGO 组织。那我们会在
I think we might have lost Mr. Luming. Mr. I, are you there? Catherine, do you think this
Yes.
connection's gone? Okay, don't worry. Thank you so much. Please, can you tell Mr. I how grateful we are for his time? I also know he has another meeting, so I'm not sure if he will jump back in. We have a couple of more questions, I'm sure, for him, which I will send through to him himself, and anyone who wants to send any further questions to Mr. I, please send them through to us and we'll make sure they are addressed. Are we getting him back?
艾总，您这边我们也考虑到您这边还有其他的会议，行程比较繁忙，
Thank you.
所以如果有其他的问题，我们后期会通过邮件再与您这边进行联络。感谢您花出了宝贵的时间，谢谢您的参与。
Thank you. I think I'm going to move on because I'm not sure we've got Mr. I back. If I move on, please, now to Sherilyn. Thank you so much for being here, and Arpan were featured in the report, and I'd love you to please introduce yourself and Arpan, and sort of talk to us about how are you connecting? Can you hear me, Sherilyn? I know you're having monsoon connection issues.
Yes, I can
How's
hear
your
you,
video?
Natasha. I'm sorry, but I don't think I'll be putting the video on because of the network connection issues, but I can hear you clearly now. Sure, thank you. So I'm Sherilyn Munyeli. I represent Arpan. We're a 14-year-old award-winning organization that works on awareness and prevention of child sexual abuse by empowering children and their stakeholders with personal safety messages through a school-based program and training and awareness building programs. To answer your question, Natasha, I think well, Arpan has been fortunate to have some great philanthropists who have trusted us and funded us with unrestricted funding right from the early stages of the organization. And if it wasn't for that, Arpan wouldn't have been able to scale to what it is today. So from a 3-member team that we started 14 years ago, we are now a 120-member team, one of the largest organizations in India working in this space. And we've been able to reach out to over 270,000 children and adults and over 1 million individuals through the individuals that we have trained. So unrestricted funding has actually given us the space to experiment and launch new programs that has enabled us to kind of scale. And in terms of the second bit, which is how it has allowed us to think out of the box and work for the benefit of the organization, I think it has allowed us to experiment and launch new programs, like I mentioned earlier, like training, which has enabled us to scale and replicate our program, which is our flagship program, which is the Personal Safety Education Program. That is a school-based program. We've been able to replicate that across the country. It has also enabled us to invest in human resource, in capacity building of people, which is an important area where funders generally don't invest in. And I think hiring the right kind of people is critical for the growth of any organization. So, typically you are asked questions around overheads, around salaries, and those kind of questions when you have restricted funding. Whereas when you have unrestricted funding, the funder is actually investing in the growth of the organization, and therefore giving the opportunity for the organization to look at hiring the right people to scale. It's also so it basically invests it's an investment in the overall growth and scale of the organization. I think it's also enabled us to collaborate with other NGOs. And a great example of that, which is also covered in the report, is the collaboration funding that we got from Global Fund for Children. So we've collaborated with an organization in Guatemala, to be able to take our content and our material and our learning modules to the children in Guatemala. Something like this is we wouldn't have been able to explore if we didn't have the collaboration funding from Global Fund for Children. So our collaboration with Association Pop Nod was possible only because of this. So there are a lot of such examples, where it's helped us. And of course, in the current situation, the current situation has literally made us innovate on how we deliver the program remotely, since schools are shut, and our model is actually a school-based model where we go into schools and we teach children and we talk to parents. So we're literally pivoting and looking at what can be done in the existing setup to reach out to our beneficiaries and reach out to their parents. Also, as an organization that looks at healing and mental health as a critical component in the well-being of of a child and all those who have gone through trauma in terms of child sexual abuse survivors, we have said that at this moment there is so much of stress and anxiety that's going around, and it's important as an organization for us to be able to do something for society and look at providing mental health support during these times. So we've, as an exception more than a norm, we've basically opened up our mental health services for anybody who needs support during COVID and and feeling anxious around it. Now that would not have been possible, and pivoting also would not have been would have been very, very difficult if we didn't have unrestricted funding. So I think these are the things that have really we've been able to benefit from unrestricted funding.
Thank you, Sherilyn. And just sort of from an India perspective, what is the norm on unrestricted funding, do you find, amongst the grassroots organizations? How do you feel funding is usually direct?
I think it's not easy to get unrestricted funding, to be very honest. I think there are, how do I put it? There are very few organizations that are, as involved and invested in the growth of an organization versus looking at it from a program perspective specifically and saying that, okay, we will invest in this program and you show me outcomes for specific to the program, versus looking at how does the organization have an overall impact or a community impact, at scale. So it's not easy getting unrestricted funding or funding for, capacity building. I think we've been very fortunate to have a few donors who have supported us along the way. But to give you an example, I think when Arpan started, 80% of our funding was unrestricted funding. Today, it's about 15 to 20%. So as the organization grows and you've established a model, it becomes easier to access the restricted funding as well, because the pool of unrestricted funding is limited in that sense. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it does, and thank you for your really valuable insights there. And just sort of, I think from the perspective of a grassroots organization, it's been really interesting to hear how sort of flexible funding has played with the adjustment of what's happened recently as well. So thank you for your insights.
If I may, I'm sorry, moving... I'd like to.
Yes, of course.
If I may add something though,
yes,
Natasha.
Absolutely,
really sorry.
Please.
Just considering the current situation, I just wanted to add that, and this is for all the organizations out there. that are attending this workshop. I think this webinar. Um, I think it's important to have conversations with your existing restricted funders as well in the current scenario, because we've seen that the funders who were, who are restricted funders, very specific, very specific on deliverables and have some rigid expectations, if I may use the word, in
Absolutely.
terms of the way the whole reporting happens and how the budget utilization happens, etc. I think we've been able to see a shift in that, because they also understand that the current situation is difficult and that requires them to show some sort of flexibility. And we've been able to go back and have conversations with some of these funders, especially those that have funded us for more than a couple of years. And even some new funders actually who reached out to us and said that, if you need any help, or if you need to relook at the entire thing, if you need any support from us, let us know. And we've been able to explain to them what our situation is and how we're looking at the program. And through dialogue, we've been able to arrive at what works for both. So it's important, what sometimes may seem very restricted in situations like these. If you open a dialogue or if you have a conversation, it is possible to kind of get some amount of flexibility even with your unrestricted funding. So I just wanted to leave that thought.
Thank you, Sherilyn. Those are great thoughts and sort of inspiring in many ways to sort of promote the conversation in existing situations which you think may not be possible to move. So thank you so much. We now move to the Malala Fund with Anubhuti Patra, who is the country representative for South Asia. Anubhuti, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, lovely to see you. How are you?
Lovely to see you too.
Nice
I'm
to
good,
see you.
thank
Okay. Now, I wanted to mainly ask you as a start, both as a fundraiser and sort of a grant maker, you're privy to both perspectives. In your dual role at the Malala Fund, how do you view flexible funding and its importance, especially at this time? Could you start with maybe exploring that? And of course, introduce yourself, please.
So I'm Anubhuti and I work as the country representative for India at Malala Fund. I have been working in around a gamut of child rights issues, mostly around child protection and education. At Malala Fund, the primary focus is on girls' education, and we work around the objectives of promoting compulsory and free education for girls for up to 12 years. We also look at the whole issue of public financing for education, increased public financing for education, because that's of course the key to girls from families that cannot afford education, and that girls of course end up in government schools more than boys do, in resource poor families and otherwise also. And at Malala Fund, our work around advocacy for girls' education is extremely important, and that's where our focus on flexible funding actually hinges on, because advocacy, as you know, is works in a living environment, where there is a flux, there is a whole dialogue around policy. It is about influencing policy to go in a direction which is more equitable for girls. So in that sense, for us, flexible funding is very, very important when it comes to our work. We also look at flexible funding as something that really helps us explore innovations, helps us look at new models which require that kind of backing and evidence to actually present new solutions for girls' education. So flexible funding for us is something that we raise. We actually do go to a pool of donors who would trust us and trust our work in that sense. And then that is the trust that we extend to people we work with also. So to give you to give you example, like one primary example is of course around advocacy and the living environment in which we work. When we come to models, for example, which need to be tested and backed up, for instance, I would give you an example of one of the current programs that we have in Bihar. We work with a very esteemed organization called CBPS, Center for Budget and Policy Studies. And this model is really around inculcating, is around a vision for education where education really empowers girls to have that kind of critical thinking skills and negotiating it for themselves, so that the choices that they make are not necessarily something that are traditional or comes out of the cultural norms that are there, and that they are active modes, active agents who are making these choices. Now, for a model like this to emerge, it has to be an action research. And for action research, if it is completely very strongly outcome driven program, it would be very difficult to incorporate various elements. Now, when you're testing something, we know that it can go either ways. It could mean that it can, the strategy is, while very ambitious, not something that will work on the ground. So for instance, in this particular action research, while the larger goal is to develop these ideas around critical thinkings and teachers being mentors for girls who are there in schools, the larger goal remains constant. But the way we reach towards that goal is something that requires constant shift as the model is being tested by CBPS at this point of time. So this makes it very important. A flexible mode of working, not having implementation plans that are set in stone is very, very important in that sense. In the light of COVID, one of the key things that we did was, and it was really immediate, and because we have this working relationship with people we work on the ground, they reached out to us very quickly. And really what the first thing that we did was to tell them to tell our grantees when the severe lockdown in India began was that reach out to us and tell us what is happening. We had these active conversations for nearly a week, which led us to actually formulate our opinion based on the country data, what was emerging and what we were hearing from our grantees. And the first thing that we did was we asked our grantees to allocate 10% of their overall grant budget, and we made it completely flexible. Now, the idea was for them to address the key needs of the families of girls that they were working with through their projects, to keep that rapport going, so that, you know, due to these extended closure of schools, girls don't face violence at homes and the various issues that we were anticipating would happen. The other thing that we so these were broad guidelines for them. The other broad guideline was this, that, you know, really look at what is the need of your staff. What is the operational changes that you need to make? Do you need a stronger internet connection? Do you need health insurance for your staff? If your staff has come down with COVID, you need to provide them with additional support. What happens to all those people who work with you on a contractual basis, and because actions are suspended on the ground, what happens to them? So these were some of the key issues that we looked at and we worked with when it came to our grantees on the field. And really this flexible funding helped them and us to understand the system, the change in the environment very dynamically. And that sort of later led us to reflect and develop a COVID specific grant making program as well as advocacy strategy in India. So we could co-create our next steps with our grantees from whom we learned a lot in the process.
Thank you. That's really really important insight at this time and from both perspectives, which is wonderful of you. Thank you, anybody. I now move to Lawrence Lian. Lawrence, are you there? Hi, Lawrence. So this is Lawrence Lian of the Asia Philanthropy Circle and chairman of the Lian Foundation. Lawrence, lovely having you here today. Thank you. I know we spoke yesterday, so I hope you're not too sick of me. But I just wanted to really would love you to share your thoughts from your practice at the Lian Foundation and also your observations at the Asia Philanthropy Circle and sort of understand a little as a large foundation, how do you measure and track outcomes, and then also as a foundation working with grantees, how do you build trust?
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Natasha. Well, I wear, as you mentioned, I wear two hats. One is as the chairman of Lian Foundation and another as the co-founder of Asia Philanthropy Circle. I'll speak a little bit about the Lian Foundation and how we run our grant making program. I think as a general point, how we fund will depend on the type of partners that you have, your strategy, or what you call theory of change, and the context, right, of the environment that you work in. And for us, the Lian Foundation, we are very much focused on new models and innovation, moving more to what we call systems leadership. And hence, it's no surprise that a lot of our funding has been very specific programs, right? But no, it's not. I would say that, between general operating support and very, very strict program funding with rigid KPIs, there's actually quite a lot in between, right? So although ours is usually program funding, and they're startup programs, we see, first of all, we see our implementing partners or charity partners as co-creators. We don't do unsolicited funding. We don't sit down like a traditional sort of gatekeeper and say yes or no to people requesting grants from us and so on and so forth, with a very laborious sort of application process. It starts with a lot of conversations. We bring our grantees. We go with our charity partners on study trips, on learning journeys. Of course, not now. We see things. We bring ideas back. We sit down through many sessions, workshop ideas, and co-create new programs. And you don't start with a prescriptive list of activities or KPIs. You must have KPIs or some outcome indicators, but they are more in the initial stage for learning, for looking to see what works, what doesn't work, what we have learned, and how we pivot. And we do that together, right? And so what the initial idea that you start out with, doesn't. Quite often, is not what you end up with, at the end in terms of implementation. So I think that's important to know, that there's a lot of in between where you can be very, very flexible, even if it's program funding. Of course, with COVID, things have changed as well. And for the first time, I guess we have started looking at well, still working with the charity partners that we have been working with, but saying, we just cut checks, to many of them, based on what we assessed are that how severe the needs are on the ground, and that's also through conversations, and say you just spend it however you want, because I think it's in a time of crisis, the needs change so quickly. Right, the on-the-ground situation is in terms of who is suffering and who isn't. It's not something that we have got great visibility, I guess, at the foundation level. Particularly if you have lockdowns and so on, and you can't go out yourself. All your data is all outdated, by the time you look at them, from all your studies from before. So yes, I think it's very important for funders to be very flexible now, with the grantees, and we've done these grants, which is very, very atypical. But we're also doing some grants where we're targeting, providing seed money, for our organizations, our grantees, our partners, to experiment, because we know that they have to pivot, some of the strategies and some of the programs. We work in the senior space, in senior care. Well, seniors have been very badly hit by COVID, and their programs, a lot have been shut down because you can't do a lot of face-to-face. They're particularly vulnerable, particularly the large group sort of activity. We're doing a second tranche sort of funding for many of our charity partners. They come up with the idea. I mean, we just say that there's this pool of money available. You just apply, and you decide what you want to do with it. But we want to know that it is being used for digital transformation. As you bring your programs online and you reach out to these vulnerable people through the internet, or service innovation, which is required, or in some cases, it's actually organizational development.
Yeah. And
yes.
Sorry. No. Sorry, I cut you off very rudely.
No. Ask you.
I was going to ask. Do you feel like is it controversial for funders to not tie funding to outcomes and perhaps challenging some of the traditional ways of philanthropy?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, it depends on the context. I mean, in Singapore, we work in an environment where charities are quite well regulated. There's a high degree of accountability, governance, transparency, right? But if you go to a place like, some of the countries around us, where there's a huge trust deficit and where regulations are rather light, to put it politely, it's very challenging, right? To just do that, and I mean the trust levels are so low that a lot of our members, for example, at APC, in the countries around us, they run operating foundations because they don't even give grants. in the best of times, and then they may not want to do that currently. But I guess, in this climate, the needs change so fast. I think what's important is that they try to build up the capacity of some of the better, organizations around. I mean, you might have a lot of weak charities, and those that you can't trust. But in any country, there'll be a good number that have got great potential. They're doing fantastic work. You should seek those out and help them build the capacity, so that they can get the more flexible sort of funding, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the work ahead, as we navigate this crisis, and navigate out of that. I think the other difficulty, is, and that's what I'm hearing from other funders in Singapore. There is a difference between funding a small setup, a smaller setup, and a much larger one. If you are funding a smaller setup, a small charity is funding GOS and funding a program is almost the same, because quite often they're delivering one program, right? And they're definitely much. They're quite prepared to fund them quite flexibly. For large charities, there might be an issue, because it's like, if you're so large, how do I know what where the money is going to go to, right?
Yeah.
And some of these are what you call conglomerate sort of charities. They do children, they do family and elderly and disabilities, and my foundation is all about just children or just about elderly, right? Again, we should explore something that's midway, right? As a possibility, say you can be flexible and say that this must go to a particular area. But you tell me how you report to me how it's used, right? After you report to me how effectively it's been used. I'm not going to prescribe that upfront. So again, it's trying to meet to seek that win-win, right, for
both ways.
parties.
Which actually leads me to a question from our audience, from Jerome Dafflickson. And I guess this is sort of for you and also for Anubhuti, if you're there, which is, have you experienced difficulties in convincing your board of trustees or directors in shifting the funding mechanism from deliverable centric to being flexible funding to support general operating support? And I guess, how have they expressed concerns over risks, and how did you create that shift with your senior leadership or the powers above or the decision makers? So if you or Anubhuti would like to answer, I'd be very grateful. And that came from the audience.
Should I go?
Yeah,
go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Lawrence. I think that the first step has always been from the existing pool of grantees that we work with. It is about believing in the capacity of the grantees that we work with. Even at the first instance, we do see a potential, we do see a connect with the community, we do see a drive to impact girls' education in that sense, and that the innovation or the recommended program might not be something that they have results for. But that really doesn't matter, because in our space as NGOs, as civil society, innovations is what we're working on, right? It's alternative models that we try to project to the government, to policymakers, to think beyond a certain box. So that sort of investment has to happen in the set of grantees, with the set of grantees that we work with. So that is one aspect of the work. In terms of convincing board members or the senior leadership, it is a culture in the organization to have not. I do understand the value of having an outcome-driven funding also, but there is a culture within the organization and within the values that we work with, that we have to have certain bold strategies that we will support. In many senses, educating girls is a step against the social norms, right? And talking about not just primary, but beyond it is again a step beyond the norms that are there. So to demand that kind of quality from the environment requires a shift in culture within the organization also. And that's where the senior leadership actually fosters that culture, and they do it by supporting innovative strategies and ideas that come to the desk.
Thank you, Anubhuti. Lawrence, what are your thoughts?
Yes, well, I mean, for the Liam Foundation, it was quite easy to convince the entire board to do some of these very flexible grants, right? And because of the current situation. I guess the question is, permanently, would would this be a permanent feature? That's a conversation to be had. But wearing my Asia Philanthropy Circle hat, how do we convince more people to do this? I guess there's a value in intermediaries, as we had mentioned just now, and collaboration, right? It takes time to trust an organization and to build a relationship. And you can really shortcut it by people who already have those existing relationships, and so and that's what we do a fair bit of at APC as well. If one member is already funding an organization that they know quite a bit about, and if you trust, you can share that with others, and join in. I mean, if you have like-minded people, you trust a peer who has, who's familiar with a program, particular organizations that in the areas they're interested in. Intermediaries, I started a community foundation of Singapore. Play an important role here as well, right?
For sure. Yeah. And we've got in the chat, intermediaries can bridge the community-based organizations who do not know the funders. Thank you. That's an amazing, I mean, what a wonderful array of views today. And it's really clear that when, I guess, just wrapping up the session now, that when we have flexible funding, that it creates space for creativity and innovation and allows us to come up with solutions that are not bound by targets and deliverables, and really provides us with a deeper moving forward in terms of what and how we work with communities with the support of grant makers. I really share my gratitude today for all of you for joining, and for the panelists for sharing their wisdom and experiences. We really appreciate it here, and we want to challenge sort of, us to continue this conversation, especially here in Asia, not only around trust, but building the relationships and what it takes to document some of these positive experiences that we can then share with other philanthropists, donors, funders, and really shifting the power and taking a stance that we are all working towards a common goal. It's really wonderful to see this passion around the sector at this time, and the responses and the roles that we all play, and especially in Asia here today. We've heard from India, from Southeast Asia and Singapore, and from China, and I think that the responses and what's happening at this time is so important to teach us. This conversation really on funding from a place of trust is poised to reach its height given the moment we're in. And we really invite you to join and take it back to your organizations and your own work today. The session and the report were made possible by support from the City Foundation, and this webinar really is a critical part of a series at Synergos on building trust and cultivating action. We'll be sending a follow-up email after this session where you can find the report as well as information on becoming part of the conversation, and any questions that were sent through on the chat that we can send elsewhere on further to our panelists or to who it needs to be addressed to, we will. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and I really hope to see you all again soon and continue this conversation. Thank you.